jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Mr. Martinez, you may continue.
Ma'am, with regard to the issue of fight or flight, I want to talk about, as it applies to memory only, whether or not you saw any indications of this memory loss associated with fight or flight after the killing. And I'm just talking about after the killing and the memory issues, whether or not you believe that it was consistent with, or whether or not you believe that it was inconsistent with the memory loss that one sees in a felony, not a felony, but a fight or flight situation.
As I highlighted earlier, when someone is in the middle of a fight or flight mode, they lose ability to engage in higher order functions. They're also called, executive functions, organization, planning. After the incident, there was evidence of deleting of photos, for example. That's an example of organization and planning. There was also indication that there was cleanup that occurred. That's organization and planning. Keeping in mind that when someone's...
You may.
memory issues as they involve fight or flight after the murder, and in terms of the organizational aspects only of this fight or flight. If an individual were in this, if the defendant was in this, let's speak generally. If an individual were in a fight or flight situation, how would it affect their memory after being in such an event?
You can see some memory impairment if a person was in fight or flight.
And explain to me, characterize it for me, what the memory impairment would be. How would it look?
It would be at a shorter duration. It wouldn't be as long as Ms. Arias is reporting.
I'm talking generally right now. I'm not talking specifically. Generally speaking, it would be a shorter duration. What else in terms of the new activities that an individual may engage in if they're in this fight or flight situation and they may experience memory loss? What is characteristic of that?
During the time...
The characteristics, ma'am, of memory loss in a fight or flight situation, you talked about short duration. Are there any other characteristics?
Specific to memory.
Specific to memory only. How memory would be affected?
We would again expect that there would be an increase of memories over time.
And as to the events that are happening at the time, shortly after the event, for example, would the individual have the organizational wherewithal, based on memory, to conduct very complex activities?
Objection, foundation based.
If they were suffering from this fight or flight memory loss?
No.
And specifically in this case, immediately or after the killing, did you see indications that the defendant engaged in this complex activity involving memory after the killing that indicates to you this is not a fight or flight memory issue?
Deleting photos would be an example.
You also, and why is that? Deleting photos, what are you talking about?
Because it's an organizational process. It involves higher order functions, as I highlighted earlier.
And so what you're saying is if a person has this issue involving the memory loss because of the fight or flight, then they wouldn't have the capacity, if you will, to do this sort of complex behavior. Is that what you're saying?
That is correct.
Of memory issues.
That is correct.
And you also mentioned something about driving to Hoover Dam. Again, in terms of the fight or flight and the memory issue, why is that important?
So what we see when an individual is in a fight or flight mode is they can do rote behavior that they've done before. It's possible to drive in a car if they've gone to that same location numerous times because it just becomes automatic. Again, not relying on some of the frontal lobe skills that I've just highlighted.
So in assessing the defendant's conduct after the killing and what you know, do you have an opinion as to whether or not there was any memory issues or any memory loss associated with fight or flight?
I don't believe that she was in a fight or flight state or that there was memory loss as a result of that.
Are you familiar with the term dissociative amnesia?
I am.
What is that?
It's a loss of memory as a result of dissociation.
And that means you're using the same words that are in the affects memory. Are you familiar with that process?
Yes.
Tell me what you know about that process.
The hippocampus is an important part of the brain that's associated with memory. What it does is it takes memories and it does what's called encoding. It takes memories from our short-term memory and it puts it into our long-term memory. It's kind of like a hallway, is one way to think about it.
And how does that impact this case, now that we know that?
What happens, one of the theories about why we see memory loss in some of the examples that I gave earlier, individuals who are exposed to child abuse repeatedly, one of the theories is that when an individual experiences trauma, they have an increase of cortisol. What cortisol does is it impacts the hippocampus. It can impact it in a couple of ways. It can cause it to atrophy, which you can think about just shrinking. It could also cause disorganization of the neurons. So what we see as a result of that is the hippocampus isn't functioning like we typically would expect it to function, which again is the process of encoding it from short-term to long-term.
And did you see this in this particular case, the phenomenon that you just described, causing, which would have resulted in memory loss?
No, because what happens with the hippocampus is if it's atrophied, it's damaged. You would expect to see continued memory impairment. It's not isolated to a very specific time period.
So what do you mean specifically in this case that it's not isolated to a specific time period?
Ms. Arias indicated to me that after the killing there was about 4 to 5 hours worth of time where she had no memory. In my interview with her, her memory was impeccable aside from that incident. She's very detailed. She remembers dates. She remembers information. There was no indication that she had continued cognitive deficits.
Did you ever have occasion to work with individuals that have been involved in abusive relationships?
Yes.
When did you begin working with individuals that were involved in abusive relationships?
2003.
And would that be in Massachusetts?
That would be when I was in Michigan.
And what is it that what kind of work did you do with people that were involved in these abusive relationships?
One of the primary lines of research at Michigan State University is a very large research lab that's dedicated to the evaluation of domestic violence victims. So in that research lab, there's a couple of psychologists that are in there, along with numerous graduate students who run this research lab that examine the impact of domestic violence.
And did you work in this lab with these other individuals?
I did.
And for how long?
I was at that lab for about a year and a half.
And what were your duties in that lab that it looks like it specialized in domestic violence?
I met with women who were exposed to domestic violence and conducted interviews with them, gave them various self-report measures about their experience of domestic violence.
And this went on for how long again?
About a year and a half.
And you did this, and what was your purpose for doing this? What would you do? What is the end result? Did you write something down? Did you give an opinion? Or what is it that you were doing when you were talking to these women?
Collecting information for a research study to see what are the impacts of domestic violence on individuals.
Since then, have you had occasion to continue working in the area of domestic violence?
Yes.
Tell me what your experience is.
Yeah, unfortunately, the prevalence of domestic violence, it occurs pretty frequently. So,
where have you worked with regard to domestic violence?
in all of my clinical settings that I've worked in.
In all your what?
All the clinical settings that I've worked in a therapeutic
Well,
manner.
let's start with the clinical settings. Go ahead and give me the next place that you worked that involved this domestic violence.
I started seeing patients in 2004, evaluating them and therapy at an outpatient clinic.
And when you say that you were evaluating, what is it that you did? I mean, it sounds like evaluating means just looking at it. What is it that you did?
Similar to what I highlighted earlier today about what a psychological evaluation is, conducting interviews, giving tests.
And how long were you there?
At that outpatient clinic from 2004 to 2008.
Can you give us a number, if you will, of the number of people that you saw that were involved in these domestic violence issues?
It's very hard to give a number. I would say it's hard for me to give a specific number. Several. It's not uncommon.
When you say you only saw 2 people, is that what you're saying?
No.
No, you said several.
Several.
So you thought 3 people? Is that what you're saying?
No, much more than that.
Well, so was this something that you did on a day-to-day basis, or describe for me the inflow and outflow of people there? I don't want numbers because you said that you don't know the exact numbers.
Sure. So I was seeing patients weekly, and I would say a large percentage of them had some sort of domestically violent background, either with them as the perpetrator or as the victim.
And when you say as a perpetrator, what are you talking about? Are these individuals that actually are accused, or how is it that they would come to your attention?
They could have come specifically for that, or they could have come for a variety of other mental health issues, such as difficulty getting along with coworkers, or potentially even depression, or whatever the presenting problem was.
And were these people that were in or out of the court system, or both?
I've done both, and at a different location other than the one we're talking about.
And after this location, where did you continue your work?
I also did work at an outpatient facility where individuals were mandated to go after engaging in a domestic battering incident.
So when you say these individuals are involved, are you talking about the people that perpetuated this, or are you talking about the people who received it, the domestic violence?
In this situation, I was talking about the perpetrator.
And how long did you work there?
I was there for a short amount of time, a few months, I believe.
Objection, Judge, just for foundation as to where this was.
Sustained.
Where?
Can I reference my CV?
Sure. Go ahead and give it to me, and I'll mark it.
Okay.
This is Exhibit 624. Take a look at it. Once you find it, let me know. And we can continue.
I got it.
All right. Without looking at it, what is the name of the place?
Prevention and Training Services.
What was it again? I didn't hear you.
Prevention and Training Services.
And where was this? What town?
This was in Michigan.
After that, did you continue working in the area of domestic violence?
Yes, and before that too, there was another place.
What was the name of the place?
I worked at a prison.
And what did you do at the prison as it applied to this issue involving domestic violence?
I conducted group therapy.
And you conducted group therapy with whom? Why don't you explain to us what it was that you did?
I did a variety of therapy there. I conducted group therapy for individuals who had engaged in a sexual crime. I also ran a group of individuals who had engaged in assaults, and that's the area specific to domestic violence where there were several individuals in there who had perpetrated violence.
After that, after those experiences in Michigan, did you continue working in this area involving domestic violence?
Yes.
Tell me about that.
Well, as I highlighted earlier with the outpatient clinic that I was working in up until 2008, several of the patients that I worked with had a history of being exposed to domestic violence.
And what was the name of the place that you worked for?
I worked at the Michigan State Clinic.
After that, did you continue working in the area of domestic violence?
Yes, when I moved here to Phoenix, I again was working at Arizona State Hospital.
And how does that, I know that you worked there, but tell us about your experience with domestic violence there at the state hospital.
I continued to evaluate and provide therapeutic services for individuals there. Again, many of them were exposed to domestic violence throughout their childhood or were the perpetrators of domestic violence.
And did you continue, as part of your work experience, to work with individuals involved in domestic violence?
Yes.
And where was the place that you continued to do so after the Arizona State Hospital experience?
When I worked at Bayless Behavioral Health Solutions, that was where I was the clinical director, there was a large population base that we worked with there. A lot of them were unfortunately exposed to domestic violence. We worked with a lot of children who had that exposure, in addition to grown women and men.
And in your practice now, do you still continue to work with people that have been involved in issues of domestic violence?
Yes, in my private practice I do.
And what's the frequency of those individuals?
See it relatively frequently. On any given week, I'm conducting anywhere between 8 to 16 evaluations, and I'll see it at a minimum in half of those. Were there any courses? Well, what is battered woman syndrome? Battered woman syndrome is a term that was coined by Lenore Walker. It describes the symptoms and the presentations that are often seen in individuals who've been exposed to domestic violence.
Is there a diagnostic indication in DSM-4 as to diagnosing somebody with battered woman syndrome or not?
No, not in the DSM.
So what you're telling us is that this individual named Lenore Walker, did she sort of become the seminal figure in this area? Is that what we're talking about?
Yes.
And what is that she described in terms of the battered woman syndrome? How is it that it became something that you are citing today?
Objection, Judge. Foundation is this witness's knowledge based on Ms. Walker's research only?
Sustained.
Did you read what Ms. Walker has written?
Yes.
And what has she written about this battered woman syndrome and as it applies to your experience in this case?
The research in this area has really developed over time. It's really been a controversial diagnosis. I'm using that loosely because, again, it's not found in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's developed over time in the sense that there's been a lot of researchers, not just Lenore Walker. There's a lot of researchers that have focused on battered women syndrome. And fortunate for people like me, who's a clinician, they put together some diagnostic criteria that helps us indicate whether someone does have battered women syndrome or not.
And having this experience, having this schooling that you have, were you able to form an opinion whether or not there was abuse in the relationship between the defendant and Travis Alexander?
I was able to form an opinion.
And what is that opinion?
My opinion is that there did not appear to be significant abuse in the relationship.
When you say it doesn't appear and significant, those are terms that are a little bit tepid. When you say it does not appear, what are you saying?
Sure. Ms. Arias indicated to me that there were 4 distinct episodes of physical domestic violence. This reporting of domestic violence has changed over time frequently. I can't go back and...
This characterizes Ms. Arias' testimony and previous testimony of other witnesses in the case.
Overruled. You will have an opportunity to cross-examine. You may continue.
Go ahead.
There's inconsistency in the reporting in that she, at the beginning, indicated that there was 2 physically domestic violent episodes. With a few evaluators, including myself, she indicated that there was 4. With one evaluator in particular, she indicated that there was numerous episodes of domestic violence. It gives the appearance, the inconsistency gives the appearance that she wasn't being truthful.
And with regard to this particular circumstance, do you place any weight whatsoever on the fact that, did you see any medical reports associated with this alleged abuse?
No.
Did you see any police reports associated with this alleged abuse?
No.
Did you see anything in writing from anybody, anecdotally, that indicated that she'd ever told anybody about this abuse here in Arizona? Anybody?
Did I see it in writing?
Yes.
No.
In light of that, is that part of what formed your opinion here, that you do not believe that there was any abuse going on in this particular relationship?
That contributed to my opinion.
And what about this battered woman syndrome? Is that something that you looked at to see whether or not the defendant met that definition of battered woman syndrome?
Yes.
And how does that differ from being in an abusive relationship, or is it the same thing?
No, not everybody who is in an abusive relationship develops battered women's syndrome.
And so what is battered women's syndrome then?
As I highlighted earlier, the research has developed this criteria, albeit it's not criteria that's in the DSM, but it's still criteria. It gives us something to look at to see if she is consistent with that. And there's 6 different criteria that is highlighted in the literature.
And
Objection, foundation, which literature?
Sustain.
what are you talking about when you say that there's in the literature? Whose literature are you talking about?
Lenore Walker's.
And with regard to that, why is it that based on what Lenore Walker laid out, you do not believe that the defendant meets the criteria for battered women's syndrome? Tell me why.
The first 3 criteria of battered women's syndrome we've already talked about in here. It's actually the same criteria that's seen in post-traumatic stress disorder. I highlighted earlier the tendency to re-experience, the tendency to avoid, and the tendency to have an increased arousal. Those are 3 of the 6 criteria.
And did she have those?
No.
What about the other 3?
The 4th one is having impaired social relationships as a result of the batterer's tendency to have power and control. What this looks like is that the victim is restricted from having any kind of relationships with other people, from engaging in social activities. Money is held from them. Their interpersonal relationships are really impaired because the batterer is controlling their movements.
And does this continue, for example, after, for example, the person is deceased or not, this impairment, or not?
No.
Did you see any evidence of this impairment as it applies to the defendant?
No.
Specifically, you talked about any of the money situation. Do you know whether or not Mr. Alexander controlled the money in the relationship with the defendant?
He did not control their money.
How about her relationship with other people? Did he, for example, stop her from speaking with whoever she wanted to? Is there any indication of that?
No, and I specifically asked her that.
And what did she say?
She said no.
What about the last factor? You've talked about factors 4, 5, now number 6.
Right, so we see that there is a sense of medical problems. What you see in women who have battered women's syndrome is that they tend to, 1, feel very poorly about their body, and 2, they tend to have a lot of medical complaints.
And with regard to the defendant, did she have a lot of medical complaints?
I specifically went over her medical history with her, and no.
How about feeling poorly about her body? Does she feel poorly about her body?
No, what you typically see with these women is that they have a global dislike for their body in general. It's not just, I don't like this aspect of my body, I don't like this, small things. It's everything. They tend to not like themselves.
So is the defendant, after this evaluation, in your opinion, a person who was a woman in a battered, being battered in a relationship?
Can you ask that again?
Battered women syndromes. Is she somebody who exhibited indications that she was involved in this kind of syndrome?
No.
I don't have any other questions. Thank you.
Cross-examination.
Good afternoon, Dr. DeMarte. Do you still have your CV up there?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I do.
Is it a yes? Okay. Great. Let's talk about that for a little bit. You received your PhD in August of 2009, is that right?
Yes,
And so that's your doctorate.
that is correct.
When you get your PhD, you're not allowed to practice as a doctor yet, right?
I'm allowed to practice
As a doctor.
as a doctor.
So you can call yourself a doctor.
Yes,
And so the state board licensing agency would not care about that.
Being called a doctor? Correct.
No, practicing as a doctor, as a psychologist.
Psychologist and doctor are different.
So which one are you?
I'm a psychologist now.
Okay. Aren't you also a doctor?
Correct.
Okay. But not a physician?
Correct.
All right. So let me get this straight then. When you graduate with your doctorate degree, okay, so that's in August of 2009, you are allowed to practice as a psychologist.
Under a psychologist.
Under a psychologist. I thought you said as a psychologist.
I'm allowed to practice under a psychologist's license. You aren't able to call yourself a psychologist until you complete the licensing exam.
Okay, that was my question. So in August of 2009, you were not a psychologist yet.
Correct.
Okay, because you just had your doctorate.
But I had my doctorate.
Right. But you weren't allowed to practice as a psychologist.
Objection, that's the answer.
Overruled.
Is that right?
As a psychologist.
Okay. But you were allowed to do things and see patients as long as you were being supervised by another psychologist.
That is correct.
Okay, and you would be supervised by the other psychologist, somebody who's actually licensed.
Yes.
All right, and typically it takes about a year to get your license, right?
No.
Well, typically you have to do 1,500 hours of work, don't you?
Not postdoctorally in Arizona, no.
Okay, but you did, right?
I chose to do that.
So that was just your choice to do.
Yes.
Rather than get your license when you could have, you just waited for a year.
I didn't just wait.
Well, you didn't get it in 2009, though, right?
I did that on purpose.
That's what I'm asking. You did
Yes.
it on. Okay, so
Objection, argumentative.
Overruled.
so in 2009, when you had your doctorate, you chose to wait to get your license for a year, right?
To continue in clinical practice under the license of someone else.
Right. So you chose to wait for a year to get your license.
Yes.
Okay. And let's talk about that. So did you not go through the whole 1,500 hours? That's not something Arizona requires you to do?
You can get that pre-doctorally before you finish, and I met the criteria. I could have received my license then. They've changed the law in Arizona.
Okay. When did they change the law?
I believe it was right before, I don't know the exact time. I don't want to mischaracterize.
All right. So you're saying that you had the 1,500 hours before your doctorate degree?
I had enough to become licensed, yes.
Okay. All right. So then, but nevertheless, you waited for that year and you worked at several different places, right?
Yes.
And when you're working for those places, you're called a fellow, aren't you?
I'm called Dr. DeMarty.
Okay. Well, let's just look at your CV for a second. Can you pull that out for me?
Yes, I have that right here.
All right. On the second page and on the first page, you call yourself Clinical Psychology Fellow, don't you?
Yes.
When you're working for these places.
Correct.
Okay. What does that mean, fellow?
Fellowship.
So you're doing a fellowship.
It's also referred to as a postdoc.
Okay. So is that what you were doing during the year that you waited to get your license?
That's correct.
All right. So let's start with September of 2009. So let's go. From September of 2009 to to October of 2009, you worked at Psychological Assessment Associates of Arizona,
Correct.
and you just did that for a month.
Correct. Well, September and October.
Okay, so a full 2 months. Is that a yes?
Yes. Sorry.
Okay, and I know on your CV you don't actually put the date. So, I mean, you have September of 2009, but not September 1st. Do you know if
Correct.
it's September 1st?
I don't know the exact date.
Okay, so do you know for sure it was 2 months versus 1 month?
Roughly 2 months, yes.
All right. And you worked there. Looks like you conducted clinical interviews.
Evaluations.
Okay, clinical interviews and administered a variety of assessment tools, right?
Yes.
Okay, and that's what you wrote in your CV.
Yes.
What kind of tools did you use?
Intellectual and memory.
Okay, specifically which ones?
The WACE.
Uh-huh.
The WIMS.
Uh-huh.
The Bender. And TRAILS. Those are all cognitive tests.
Okay. Anything else?
At this specific place?
Yes.
No.
And it looks like you were working with people who were applying for some type of impairments, right? Claimants? What kind of people were you working with there?
A broad range of individuals who were applying for Social Security disability.
Okay. So when you talk about in your CV, you talk about claimants, you're talking about people who are applying for disability with their Social Security?
Yes, that's the verbiage they use.
I'm sorry?
That's the verbiage they use to describe.
Okay. All right. And so you were there for about 2 months. Why did you leave?
I decided to leave because I wanted more of a forensic experience,
All right.
which I was already participating in.
And this particular place, it's not in business anymore, is it?
As far as I know, yes.
Under the same name?
I actually, not as far as I know it is. I don't know if it's under the same name, but yes.
Okay. So maybe they changed names?
Objection, speculation, lack of foundation, asked and answered.
Do you know if they changed names?
No, I
Okay.
don't know.
About how many hours a week did you work there?
About 20.
And then August of 2008 to August of 2009. So now we're talking a year before that. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. You worked as a clinical psychological intern or a resident, right?
Correct.
And you told us a little bit about that when you worked at Arizona State Hospital.
Yes.
Is that right? Okay. So that's prior to your doctorate, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And that's why you're called an intern or a resident?
That's correct.
All right. And then the September of 2009 to January of 2010, it looks as though you overlapped. So at the same time you were working at the psychological assessment with the disability people, you were also working at Buwalda Psychological Services?
That's correct.
Okay, and you worked there for just 3 months, right?
That's correct.
And it says that you conducted clinical interviews and did several assessment tools, right?
That's correct.
What kind of tools did you use here?
I was doing 2 different types of evaluations there. I was doing evaluations for CPS and was administering, again, the WACE and the MMPI, and also a variety of other tools depending on what the actual question was at hand.
Okay, like what?
I've used, let's see, I did the BASC, for example, with some children. The BASC is a measure of psychopathology in children.
Okay.
I've used the TAT.
TAT?
Uh-huh.
Okay. And what's that for?
General psychopathology, if there was an indication that the person may have some more severe psychopathology,
Okay.
we'd give it to them.
All right, what else?
Those are the 2 that come off the top of my head, but there was a variety. I had access, fortunately, to a number of different instruments there.
Anything else that you can remember then?
Not off the top of my head.
All right. And about how many hours a week did you work there?
I was there 20 hours also.
So for the time that you overlapped with the other place, were you working full-time at that point?
I was working full-time across the both places together, yes.
Okay. Well, from here, it looks like from October of 2009 to January of 2010, it appears that you were just working at the Buwalda place, right?
Well, clinically, I also was teaching during that time.
Okay. Well, I'm just talking about working
Okay.
at these places. So when you're working at Buwalda, is that 20 hours a week?
It fluctuated. Some weeks I would work a little bit more. I'd ask for more evaluations, some weeks less.
Okay. And typically, how many evaluations did you do in a week?
With that placement in particular,
Yes.
I really would be, I'm just estimating.
Sure.
Maybe 4
Okay.
to 5.
Okay. And you worked there at this Buwalda place for a total of 3 months, right?
Correct.
And then after that, you moved on again, right?
Yes.
And why did you leave there?
I decided that I wanted to spend more time studying for my exam.
Okay. So is that why then you took 2 months off?
I didn't take 2 months off.
Oh, how long did you take off?
I was teaching during that time.
Okay. So besides teaching, were you working at some other place?
No, I was just teaching.
Okay. So is that the extra time that gave you to study for your exam?
Yes.
Okay. Because you said you took time, you wanted to study for your exam, right?
Yes.
Okay. So during this time, how long did you take off from working, besides teaching, to study for your exam?
The time until I worked at Bayless Behavioral Health.
When you worked at Bayless?
Yes,
Okay. And that started in March of 2010, right?
that's correct.
All right. And so from basically January of 2010 till March of 2010, you weren't working in a clinical setting.
Say that again?
You weren't working in a clinical setting.
Tell me the time span again?
Oh, January 2010 to March of 2010.
Yes, that's correct.
All right. Then, Now, at Bawalda, you said that's the place that you worked with kids who were involved in CPS, right?
Not just children, there are parents also.
Right, but kids too.
Yes,
Okay. And so during that time, you were doing psychological evaluations on the adults and the children who came into you from CPS?
yes,
And these were evaluations. You weren't giving them therapy at the same time?
I was not conducting therapy there, correct.
Okay, so just doing these evaluations?
Yes,
These evaluations that you talk about needing to remain unbiased, right?
yes.
How many evaluations did you do with regard to these adults and children for CPS, do you think?
Total?
Sure. During this time at Bawalda?
Again, that varied. It's hard for me to give a specific number. Some weeks I would have 1, some weeks I'd have 4. It would depend on the week.
Okay. So over these couple of months, you would have anywhere between, I guess, 4 a month to 12 a month. Does that sound about right?
Sure. It's hard to pinpoint exactly how many. I wasn't sitting there writing down and tallying.
Okay. Well, part of doing these evaluations, you learn about especially with the kids, let's say for a second. Don't you learn a lot you have to know about their background, right?
Yes,
And sometimes they're going to tell you things about where they came from,
yes,
if they're in a foster home or if they've been homeless.
yes,
And some of the things you might learn that these children have been beaten.
yes,
And sometimes these children might not have anyone to really count on them at this point, right? Because they're coming to you, they might be involved in CPS.
it's potentially, yes,
Okay, well, in other words, you dealt with these children who had a myriad of problems that they were dealing with in their lives, right?
yes,
And so during this time that you're dealing with these children, as a human being, you're saying not ever did you feel 1 ounce of compassion for any of these children since you were evaluating them?
When I walked in there and met with them, no. Did I feel compassion immediately off the bat? No.
No. I'm not talking immediately off the bat because you don't know anything about them. But I'm talking about, listening to their hard stories and how these children might have been beaten or how they might have been homeless. After listening to these as an evaluator, you're telling us because you're able to be unbiased, not 1 ounce of compassion.
I was able to feel some compassion, but not in the way that it would cause me to be biased.
Okay, so you are able to feel some compassion then.
At some point, if it depends on the scenario.
Okay, so at some point, depending on the scenario, you as an evaluator can feel compassion for someone you're evaluating.
It's possible.
It's possible. And when this possibility arises to have some type of compassion, you're saying that you were able to, let's see, at this point it would be, well, you didn't have your license yet, right? At the time we're talking.
Correct.
And so at this point during your practice, then, you would be able to have this compassion and remain unbiased, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. And at this point in time, you really didn't have much experience. You just got your doctorate a year before, right?
That's incorrect.
So you had lots of experience.
I had experience.
Okay. Lots of experience?
I started seeing patients in 2004.
Okay. So when you start seeing patients, then, that's what gives you experience then. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Okay. And so your education isn't necessary?
Necessary for what?
Well, to have the knowledge to do what you do.
Of course it's necessary.
But you just told me that experience is also necessary too, right?
The first time I saw patients was in 2004. It was the first time that I had experience in seeing patients in a therapeutic and evaluative role.
Okay. So if you've been seeing patients since 2004, and now we're talking about a time in 2009 for a few months into 2010, right, when you're seeing these CPS kids, right?
Correct.
So at that point in time, you had seen some patients from 2004 until 2009, right?
Yes.
Okay. And so that 5-year experience of seeing patients was enough for you to be able to remain unbiased whenever you felt compassion for one of your evaluations.
Yes.
And so with 5 years of experience with these evaluations, that's enough then?
I'm not saying that's enough. It was enough for me.
Okay. Enough for you to be able to remain unbiased even though you couldn't feel some compassion?
Correct.
And these evaluations that you're conducting and that you're talking about for these 5 years, these are supervised, right?
Yes.
So in other words, you're not allowed to do them by yourself.
Under the supervision of a psychologist.
So you can't do them by yourself.
That's correct.
And the psychologist, that's somebody who's licensed, right?
That's correct.
And the psychologist is the one who's watching over you or to make sure that your evaluations are done appropriately.
Correct.
And wouldn't you agree, somebody who is just coming into doing evaluations, even let's say in 2004, wouldn't you agree that you learn along the way how to do them, don't you?
In school, yes.
So you think you learned how to do evaluations in school, and then when you get out in 2004, you conducted them perfectly?
I would never say perfectly. I think that's extreme. But what you find is that the bulk of information that you learn about evaluations is certainly in school and education.
Okay. So then the experience that we were just talking about doesn't matter so much as schooling does.
I would say that schooling takes the priority over it. By the time I got to the point that you're referencing, I was doing these independently. I'm not taking away that the psychologist was certainly there in the sense that I was practicing under the psychologist's license. I was a person sitting in the room. I was a person administering the test, interpreting the test, and writing up the report completely independently.
Okay. And then a psychologist was reviewing your work, right?
Yes.
And that fail-safe is there to make sure that people without licenses are doing it correctly, right?
Correct, and that's what I do now for students.
Okay. In fact, you did that right as soon as you got your license, didn't you?
Yes,
You started supervising students?
that's correct.
Okay. You started working at Bayless Behavioral Health Services in March of 2010, right?
Correct.
And as a fellow, you worked there from March of 2010 till August of 2010, is that right?
Correct.
And then in August of 2010, that's when you get your license.
In July.
Oh, July, okay. Is that right?
Correct.
So then in August of 2010, you stay at Bayless, but now you're considered a psychologist.
And the director of the agency.
So they hired you on as director of the entire agency as soon as you got your license?
Immediately.
Okay. And how many people did you supervise?
It was a large agency, so the numbers fluctuated over time.
Uh-huh.
So generally, there was roughly about 30 master's level students. And doctorate level, anywhere 4 or 5.
Okay. So this is all at one time? You would have to supervise 30 master level people?
The way that it was structured was that I had a handful of people that were underneath me, that I supervised them, and they would supervise the remaining of the students. But the way that the agency worked is that many of the, I misspoke, not students, staff. Many of the staff would come to me on a regular basis to provide that additional supervision. I have served as a secondary supervisor for all of them.
Okay, secondary supervisor, I'm a little bit confused. So you supervised a handful of what?
Of master's level staff.
Okay. And those master level staff then would supervise whom?
They would also supervise other staff, other master's level staff.
Okay. And when you're talking staff, are these people who are master level seeking their masters in psychology? Or what?
Not seeking, they had their degrees already in counseling or social work.
Okay. And these are the people that you were supervising?
In addition to students.
Okay. And the students are whom?
The students were master's level and doctoral level students. So those were the individuals who were in the process of obtaining their degrees.
Okay. All right. So you supervised the people who had their degrees, and the people who had their degrees supervised people who didn't have their degrees?
No, I supervised both. Some that had their degrees and some that did not. Because I was one of the only psychologists there, we didn't have a lot of psychologists there. I participated in supervising the doctoral students.
Okay. So you didn't supervise the master level students?
I was the one that was in charge of the entire program. Again, for those students, I served as a secondary supervisor. I had master's level therapists that were underneath me, and they were supervising the students, and then they'd come to me for as a secondary. Because in this field, there's a lot of stuff that changes on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes their supervisors weren't available. Sometimes the case was complex and they needed help.
Okay. How many psychologists were at Bayless at the time you were there?
It changed. It was
at the time that you were supervising?
It changed over time. I was at that position for 2 years.
Okay. Well, I mean, what's the lowest amount?
2.
Okay, and what's the highest amount?
There wasn't a lot of doctoral level. Are you including psychiatrists in that also?
Psychologists and psychiatrists, sure.
Okay. Maybe 5?
5 would be the highest? Is that a yes?
Yes.
Okay, and did that include you as well?
No, you said that I supervised.
No, not supervised. How many psychologists or psychiatrists were, you said that there were not that many psychologists in
Right.
Bayless.
Right.
So were there other psychologists, licensed psychologists that worked at Bayless?
Yes.
Okay, all right, that's what I'm asking about.
Okay.
Not who you supervised.
Okay.
Okay, so is that the numbers that you just went through?
So the number of licensed psychologists there were 4.
4. Is that something that remained the same?
Well, then some people would become licensed, so it would change over time as more became licensed.
Okay, all right. You talked about supervising some of the master level people, right?
Correct.
And you agree, you don't know Miss Alice LaViolette, right?
I do not know her.
You've never met her,
That's correct.
and you've certainly never supervised her, right?
That's correct.
And you're aware that she got her master's degree in 1980, right? Do you know this?
No.
Okay, well, if I told you she got her master's level in 1980, you wouldn't have been able to supervise her way back then, right?
Do you mean before she was licensed?
No. She got her master's
Understand.
in 1980. You were, what, were you just born, or?
So
you
I would
wouldn't be
not-
around to supervise her, is what I'm saying.
Correct.
Okay. All right, let's talk a little bit about your internship at Arizona State Hospital, okay? That was, let's see, August 2008 to August of 2009, right?
Correct.
And it looks like you were doing forensic evaluations there?
Yes.
And specifically, you worked with guilty, except insane people?
With that aspect of the hospital, there's 3 different aspects of the hospital.
Okay. So, well, you worked with, what type of people, what type of populations were you working with there?
So there's 3 sides of the hospital: the guilty, except insane.
Right.
There's also the side of the hospital that's referred to as the non-criminal side, the civil side.
Civil,
So these are individuals who have been in and out of hospitals and need a longer stay residence, sometimes for several years. They have not engaged in a crime. It's possible that they could have engaged in a crime, but that's not why they're there.
Okay.
There's also the side of the hospital that houses the sexually violent people,
Okay, so, and those are often referred to as SVPs?
SVP.
Okay. So did you do evaluations on all 3 different sections?
I did evaluations on the civil and the forensic side, the GEI side, not on the SVP.
So you didn't do any evaluations on the SVP?
I did therapy.
Oh, you did therapy with them? Oh,
Yes.
okay. All right, so is that the only group that, is that the only population that you did therapy with, or did you do it with anybody else?
I did it with the civil and at the forensic also.
Okay. And you said you used forensic and neuropsychological testing instruments?
Yes.
Which ones did you use?
All of them?
Other than what we've
Some-
already spoken about.
The whole Halstead-Rattan battery,
Okay.
which includes numerous tests in there. California, the CBLT, the RBLT.
Okay.
There's numerous tests, the MMPI, the MCMI,
Okay.
the back. Keep going.
Well, let me ask you this: did you do any did you ever use the PDS while you were there?
I did not.
Okay. And did you write reports when you did you do any evaluations?
At the state hospital? Yes.
Okay. And were those for the guilty, except insane? Is that the forensic side that you did?
I did it on the civil side also.
Okay. So you wrote reports then?
Yes.
And who were you writing reports for?
For the hospital,
Okay. So the state?
the state hospital.
Okay. So the state hospital would be the one who was seeking reports from you.
The specific referral would come from the psychiatrist.
Okay. All right. And then you would be writing reports that the state hospital would be using?
Yes.
Okay. When you were giving therapy to the sexually violent persons, how long did you do that for?
For the year that I was doing my residency.
Okay. And during that year, then you would, I would imagine, become familiar with these type of people, right?
Yes, that was not the first time that I worked with that population.
Okay. So you were familiar with them then, right?
Yes.
And in being familiar with people who, well, you also worked, prior to this, you also worked in with people having to do with sex crimes?
Yes.
Okay. And when was that?
2007?
And is that when you were in the prison, or is that
That's
at Michigan
correct.
State?
The prison.
The prison, okay. And so you specifically, the criminal sexual conduct group?
Correct.
Okay. So those 2 times you were working with people having to do with sex crimes, is that right?
There's been other times also, but yes.
I know in your future you did it as well, too.
Correct.
Okay. So when you're working with these type of people, you would learn how to deal with them, right?
Yes.
And giving them therapy, you would talk to them?
I would do therapy with them, yes.
Okay, well, when you do therapy with somebody, you talk to them, don't you?
Yes.
All right. And when you're talking with them, you are, well, in a therapeutic setting, right? So you want them to open up with you
Yes.
because you want them to tell you what they're thinking.
I want to be able to appropriately do treatment with them.
All right. And to appropriately do treatment, you need to know from them what's going on, right?
Correct.
And in dealing with these people who commit sexual crimes, you're aware that they often tend to minimize what they've done, right?
Yes.
And they often tend to deny what they've done.
Yes.
And they often distort their offending behaviors, don't they?
That's correct.
And in these situations, it wouldn't be unusual for their family members to not know what was going on, right?
No.
So you think they tell their family everything that they've done?
No.
So it would be unusual. It wouldn't be unusual for the family to not know about this offensive behavior.
I disagree.
So you think then that the family would know?
I wouldn't say 100% of the time, but I don't think it would be unusual.
So in other words, these sex offenders or people with criminal sexual crimes, they might minimize and deny about their acts, but they're going to run and tell their family what they've done?
Objection, lack of foundation, minimize, deny, and speculation as to whether they tell their family.
She just agreed to all that.
Overruled.
Can you ask the question again?
Sure. So these people who are denying and distorting
Sure.
what they've done, their offensive behaviors, right? That's your experience?
Yes, they have a tendency to do that.
Oh, okay. And so people who do that, then you're saying that the family would still know their offensive behaviors?
That is correct.
Okay. And because they're going to tell their friends about it too then?
No, because a lot of sex offenders have a proclivity for engaging in sexual crimes that then lead to a crime that is then brought to the attention of the family, or they catch them in the act, or the police catch them and they become part of the system.
Oh, okay. So the family knows about it because the family was the victim, right? The family could know about it because a member of the family was the victim?
That's one reason that could be.
Okay. Or the family caught them?
That's another potential reason amongst others.
Okay. So, but these are the reasons, or the person gets arrested and then the family knows about it.
Right, or the person is engaging in behaviors that would be consistent with whatever their sex crime is. So for example, if there was a pedophile, we would expect to see consistent behavior with that. Them engaging in activities with children frequently, having child pornography, engaging in behaviors that would be suggestive of that would indicate to the family.
And you think the family is going to always know about this then, because they're not going to hide it from the family?
Always? No.
Okay. So the family's going to find out about it when the person gets arrested?
There's a potential for them to find out when they're arrested, amongst the other examples that I just gave you.
Okay. These people who distort and deny their offensive behavior, though, do you also think that their friends are going to know about it?
I would say the same answer as I just did for the family.
Okay. And then same with their coworkers. Their coworkers are going to know about it too?
Get the same answer I just gave.
Okay. So everybody but you, the therapist, is going to know about their offensive behavior?
I think you're mischaracterizing what I've been highlighting.
Well, but you're saying that these people deny and distort these things when you're talking to them about their behavior, but somehow their coworkers and their friends and their family are going to see these offensive behaviors that they deny to you.
I'm saying that they have a tendency to deny and distort. That is correct.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that it's not possible and doesn't happen frequently for people in their life to be aware of it because of the things that I highlighted earlier, such as engaging in other behaviors that would be suggestive of, for example, the pedophilic behavior.
Okay. And later on in your career, well, I guess just recently at Bayless, right? You worked with risk assessments? Sexual risk assessments, psychosexual risk assessments?
Yes.
Okay. And that's what you were talking about as far as also working with people who are involved with criminal sexual activity, right?
That was one.
Okay.
There's others.
Okay. In April of 2008, I'm going to when you were an evaluator, and I'm about the prevention and training services in Lansing, Michigan. Do you see that on your CV?
Yes.
Okay. And you said you worked there for, is that 2 months?
Yes.
And during that time in your CV, you're talking about conducting individual unstructured interviews, right?
Yes.
And unstructured means they're what?
The difference between structured and unstructured, structured would be a very specific format that would be laid out with a test that says you have to ask exactly this question, this question, this question, rather than a typical clinical interview that does not specifically indicate that you have to ask specific questions.
Okay, so you were talking to these people in an unstructured interview.
This similar to what a clinical interview is, yes.
Okay. Well, you didn't put clinical interview, right? You wrote unstructured interview.
I did.
Okay. And in particular, in your CV on this particular part, you said that you were interviewing domestic batterers and alcohol abusers. Is that right?
Yes.
And in this particular part of your CV, you actually noted that you worked with domestic batterers, right?
Yes.
And that you wrote treatment plans,
Right.
right? And that was for 2 months.
Yes.
And that was before you got your doctorate.
Yes.
And that was before you got your license.
That's correct.
So is that considered practicing before you get your doctorate?
Yes.
Okay. So at what point do you start practicing? What degree do you have to consider a practice?
It depends on how you use the terminology. How are you using it?
Well, if you're practicing as a psychologist, let's say. So if you're practicing as a psychologist, when does that practice begin?
When you become a psychologist.
Okay. So when you become a psychologist, that's when you get your doctorate, right?
No.
Okay. When do you become a psychologist?
You become a psychologist when you take the licensing exam after you've completed your doctorate.
Okay. So you can start your practice as a psychologist after you get your license?
By using the term psychologist, yes.
Yes. Okay. All right. With regard to these domestic batterers that you talked to for 2 months, you didn't do any type of assessment tools on them?
No.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the research that you laid out in your CV, okay?
Sure.
The last research you've conducted was in April of 2008?
Yes.
Okay. And you haven't done any research since then?
No, I've become a clinician.
Okay, so you don't do any research at all anymore?
I do not.
And ultimately, the research that was in 2008, that was for your dissertation?
That's correct.
And you used that research to receive your doctorate?
I completed it for my dissertation, which led to receiving my doctorate.
Okay. And after you just graduated, let's see, your bachelor's degree, looks like you worked in a lab as a graduate research assistant?
Are you talking about after my undergraduate degree?
I'm sorry, I'm talking about August 04 to August 07. So that's during your master's, right?
Yes.
Okay, and you worked as a graduate research assistant?
That's correct.
And that was just after your bachelor's then, right? You started doing that after your bachelor's?
That's correct.
Okay, and after your bachelor's, in this particular part of your CV, you talk about that you, I guess you interviewed mothers and children who were experiencing domestic violence? Or did you interview them as part of your research?
You're referring to two different areas of the CV.
Oh, you're right, I'm sorry. I'm referring to 03 to 04, right? August 03 to 12 of 04.
Yes,
Okay. And during that time, you were a graduate research assistant, right?
that is correct.
All right. And as part of your research that you did during that time, you interviewed mothers and children?
Not children.
Oh, not children. Did you just interview mothers?
Mothers.
Okay.
Yes.
And that was about who were experiencing domestic violence.
Right.
Okay. And what kind of tools did you use to do these interviews?
They were research tools,
Okay. So what does that mean?
meaning that they weren't used for clinical purposes. They were used to collect data for research.
Okay. So you weren't doing any kind of therapy.
No, this was a research project.
Okay. So you're just collecting data.
That's correct, for purposes of research.
All right. And so did you have a specific interview form that you would know which questions to ask?
Yes.
Okay. And you would just follow through that form?
Well, that and give them the questionnaires that were associated with the research study.
Okay. Well, so in other words, there were specific questions that you're asking them.
Yes.
All right. And did you stray from that?
When needed.
Okay.
Yes.
And with regard to that, then when you would, how many people did you interview? Do you remember?
I do not have a memory of the number.
All right. And particularly in your CV, you specifically mention here that you collected data for a study for mothers and children experiencing domestic violence, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And you've done a couple of lectures?
More than a couple.
Did you have a monthly lecture series that you did at Bayless?
Weekly.
Weekly? Is your CV updated? Does it say
was-
weekly in your CV?
Where are you?
I'm on page 5. Under selected lectures.
Right, so there was weekly lectures, and I would give a lecture myself monthly, but I was in charge of all the lectures.
Okay, so my question is does your CV say monthly lectures?
Yes,
Okay, and so you would give a lecture monthly?
roughly, yes.
And there were other people who were giving lectures as well?
The other psychologists.
Okay, and these lectures were given to whom?
To our staff and our students.
Okay, so this was all in-house then?
In that one in particular, yes.
And prior to that, you gave a lecture that was termed The Disruptive Physician?
Yes,
And the audience on that was healthcare lawyers, right?
yes,
That was in May of 2012?
yes.
And prior to that, you gave a lecture to middle school students?
Yeah, no,
No?
no.
You didn't lecture Opportunity Knox at Supine Middle School?
Not to students,
Oh, okay. Who was that to?
to staff,
The staff at the school?
yes.
Is that a yes? Okay, and that was in March of 2012.
Yes.
And there's no lectures prior to that, right?
There's no lectures that I have listed on there,
Okay. And then no lectures after August of 2012.
but I've given other lectures.
So you just didn't put them on your CV?
Right,
Okay.
that's correct.
So you added things to your CV. You've added things in your experience, but you just didn't put it on your CV.
Right, so lectures, for example, I don't spend time adding stuff like that to my CVs because it's
They're
secondary.
not important to you?
Not that it's not important, it's just secondary to seeing my patients.
Uh-huh. So secondary to your patients, you see the need not to add it to your CV then?
I don't use my CV very often.
Okay. Well, you remember when we had an interview with you, right, a couple months ago?
Yes.
Okay, and when we walked in on that interview, you handed us an updated CV, didn't you?
Yes.
Okay. But I guess it wasn't really totally updated.
Right.
Okay. Let's talk about... oh,
At this time, ladies and gentlemen, 9:30 tomorrow morning. Please remember the admonition. You are excused. Have a nice evening. You may step down. Record will show the jury has left the courtroom. Counsel, is there anything else?
Good.